Susie Richardson, a very warm welcome to the podcast. So obviously you were former governor of La Moye Prison and you're also previously deputy governor of Winchester Prison before joining La Moye in February 2021, where you spent 3.5 years before resigning last July, I believe. So during your time there, you introduced lots of major changes and progressive reforms, from lifting the ban on tea bags, which were previously prohibited to prevent prisoners from trying to smoke them, bizarrely, to strengthening an internal prison council that allows inmates to hold prison authorities to account. So when you first took over as governor of La Moye, what were your first impressions, and was there anything about it that surprised you?
It was a really funny start because it was the pandemic, and you wouldn't normally take over a prison that you'd never visited. And my first couple of weeks were isolating and meeting people online. So it was an unusual start from that point. And also there'd been a gap since the previous governor and the deputy governor at the time had retired. It was a really interesting start. And I remember on my first day, in fact, my first time going into the prison was on a Saturday for a COVID injection. So again, that really is a space in time, isn't it? But wandering around the prison and just feeling like I have to love this place because we've moved here, given up school places, and this is where we are. But yeah, I mean, what's overwhelming about that prison is the quality of the staff and the beautiful relationships with prisoners. There was a lot of building going on at the time, and some of that I'm really grateful came to fruition, and I was able to benefit from that in my tenure. And also a number of old buildings that were derelict and in fact had been used for exercises by the fire service over the years, and so gave a really disarming kind of feel to the prison, but also showed a history of a prison that has been quite challenging at times, and that's in living memory, and prison officers can talk about kind of the dark days of La Moye. But essentially the units that people were living on were good and familiar and built by the same companies to the same spec that I was used to. So there was a lot that was familiar about the prison on arrival.
Fantastic. And you've actually led visits to Norway to learn about their prison systems, which emphasise rehabilitation over punishment. So were there any jurisdictions or prisons kind of globally that you looked to as models for inspiration when you were at La Moye? And how would you compare La Moye's facilities and regime to what you'd seen kind of abroad in your experiences?
Yeah, so I've worked in 9 prisons. I've had the privilege of following a husband in a military career, and so moving every couple of years. And that's anything in terms of range of security, male, female and young people. I'm a bit of a prison geek. So the chance to go to Norway, and I was being mentored by an area manager in Norway, and to take a team from prison and probation here in Jersey was such a privilege. The thing that I think that I bring with me, or brought with me from those prisons in the UK, a background of a master's in psychology and forensic psychology and research, and looking at what was working well in Bergen, is looking at the evidence base, because not everything about running a prison is intuitive and instinctive. In fact, quite a lot goes against instinct, and therefore it's understanding the real importance of holding on to what is done well in Jersey and La Moye, and there's an awful lot of that, but ensuring that we're using the data, the evidence and the international research to inform what we do and shape the future.
And you obviously got a well-deserved reputation as quite a reformist kind of governor. Did you ever feel any tension between maintaining security and reducing risk for inmates and kind of pushing those reforms? And how do you kind of strike that balance?
La Moye's got the tallest fences in Europe when it comes to prisons, and actually is a very in most ways, a very security conscious place. If anything, and the tea bags is a great example, a risk averse place. So, and it's also, and as the recent inspection has recognised, a really safe place with low levels of violence and self-harm. So the day-to-day kind of operational running was really solid and meant that we could focus on some of the through the gate things, preparing people towards the end of their sentence and working through and beyond those tall fences with groups and different departments in government to really join up the end of the sentence bit.
And La Moye is a category A prison, isn't it?
Parts of the infrastructure are.
Okay.
But with category A, it takes a lot of resource in terms of levels of searching, additional levels of searching and dogs and the type of escort you'd do to court. So that's not a normal, we don't generally follow Cat A procedures, but La Moye can and has in the past stepped it up for really high profile trials.
For the benefit of our listeners, by which we mean that it houses high security inmates as well as kind of vulnerable people and obviously female detainees as well in the one facility, given that we're one island with one prison.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's the infrastructure has the potential to hold a Cat A prisoner for a period of time. That's not how it's run on a day-to-day basis, and rightly so. And that is one of the real complexities about La Moye, as you point out. In the UK, the population of La Moye would be spread across a local remand prison, training prisons, women's prison, juvenile prisons. So it is doing it all in one place. And the principle in UK prisons is that you hold people in the lowest possible security category to manage their risk. Whereas the very nature of having one prison here means that people are being held in a potentially more restrictive way than they need to in terms of their risk.
Exactly, because you've got that kind of mixed population. So particularly things like, day release or community service for low-risk offenders, it's probably more difficult to implement things like that if you just have the one kind of facility to work with.
Again, those things are procedural, and the team's done a great job, even since I've left, to progress some of those things. La Moye's built of a number of different units. What you don't want is somebody going out every day and coming back to the same unit and mixing with people who are in there long term. That presents all sorts of security and kind of dynamic risks, really. But it has got some smaller units that they've used really well and innovatively, and a lot of this does require risk-taking and innovation. And they've done that very well to step up some of those opportunities.
Are all these units completely segregated and separate from each other, or is there any kind of interaction between the units?
So much more segregated than I've seen anywhere else.
Okay.
And I say that mostly in a positive way. It's a very well-controlled environment, but it can make it very difficult if you're trying, or in an already small prison, to get together a group of people for an intervention, for example, or even prison council, where there's not a culture of mixing between wings, which has some real benefits. It can make that kind of economies of scale thing even more challenging. So with everything in prison, you're balancing the risk of doing something and not doing something. It's a compromise all the time in terms of which of those you go with.
So let's talk about the prison council. So was there a representative from each one of the wings or units that would sit on that council to represent the people within their unit? Was that the way that it worked? Or
Yeah, no, absolutely. So previously it was operating in pockets on wings at a kind of wing manager level.
Right.
And so we joined it up to become one big prison council, generally chaired by me or the deputy, and often very well attended by the leadership team. And that gave us such an opportunity to connect with kind of the ground floor experience, what's actually happening, and responding to some great ideas that prisoners would present. And also that kind of transparency of hearing those ideas in a public forum and being accountable for responding to what we might take forward and what we couldn't take forward, and giving really transparent answers about that. So I think that was the transformation. Joining the wings together and having the senior leadership team attend meant that we could move some of those things a lot more quickly.
Because in the past in Jersey, prisoners were able to carry out sort of supervised work in the community, including at people's homes, which likely helped with their reintegration when they were released. What are the kind of biggest constraints at La Moye when it comes to expanding those kind of programs? Is the issue a lack of funding, or is it kind of politically unpopular to do things like that? Why is it that we've done that in the past and we don't do that now?
Yeah, I think some of it's about risk and control. And so when I talk about those burnt out buildings and stories of a time when the prison was not so decent and not so safe, there's clearly in the history of La Moye, there's been massive investment in making it more safe and secure. And that's beautifully reflected in the recent inspection about the impact that's had. But with that, if you've got very tall fences, as La Moye has, and a lot of infrastructure, security infrastructure and control, it's not surprising the culture changed around allowing people to go in and out of the front gate every day. So I think there was a massive cultural shift that actually led to a real cleaning up of the prison. Again, having those opportunities of releasing people to do really good stuff is important for their resettlement or their settlement, their rehabilitation, engaging and giving back to the community. But there are some risks with that, both in terms of that being deliberately abused by prisoners or prisoners being put under pressure, unreasonable pressure that can actually jeopardize their prison sentence and get them into situations that they didn't intend to get into. So it is a really fine balance. And there are programs where far smaller in number, but where prisoners can come out on ROTL, which is release on temporary license on a daily basis. And also, Jersey has a brilliant scheme of CER, which is an early release scheme, which is a genuine motivation for prisoners to demonstrate consistently kind of pro-social behaviour in prison in order that they can be released early. And the conditions of that early release are really tied down. So the prisoner needs to attend a board and explain how they'd use that time, that early release time. And that's very tightly controlled time. That's specific to Jersey and something that is much better managed in Jersey than I've seen managed elsewhere.
And during that process, then would you ensure that the inmate had had accommodation, was going to be housed, but had some kind of employment opportunity kind of lined up before that they were released, so that they did feel reintegrated and they could integrate more easily back into sort of the community?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are 7 things. Humans are pretty formulaic. That's why we have to rely on the evidence. There are 7 things that you need to get right for somebody to be released from prison and not to come back. And the evidence consistently all over the world supports that. Employment and education is one of those.
Yes.
Accommodation is another. Being drug and alcohol free is another. And so we literally go through, before considering someone for early release, you look at all 7 of those factors and look at how that's being met in their early release period. So they would absolutely need appropriate accommodation, and thorough work goes on. Probation officer would visit that accommodation, and prison and probation work really closely together in preparing for and agreeing that early release. And also, while out, a prisoner is subject to random testing, so drug and alcohol at any time, and it would be very clear in their early release whether they were allowed to drink any alcohol at all. And again, that's linked to their risk of reoffending and the circumstances of their crime. So it's a really well-managed scheme in Jersey.
Brilliant. And some people say La Moye is too much of a cushy nick and kind of scoff at sort of progressive reforms as basically, wanting to put chocolates on their pillows and that type of thing. How would you respond to those critics who kind of argue that way and then say that, prison's meant to be a deterrent, it's meant to be kind of punitive, and that, any kind of progressive reforms might risk kind of public safety?
Yeah, again, really important to look at what the evidence says. And broadly speaking, and this is where the Scandinavian prisons have functioned so well and are so effective in reducing reoffending rates, is the evidence basically says that the better the conditions are in prison, the less likely somebody is to come back. So that's where I talk about our instinct or our assumption might be that a grotty prison stops someone coming back. It doesn't, because what you're actually dealing with is traumatized people. And that's in no way asking for sympathy. You know, I recognize that victims are very traumatized people. But it's generally true that people in prison have got trauma in their background. They are alienated by the nature of coming to prison.
Yes.
And actually the evidence would suggest that the more decent and dignified those conditions are, the safer it is to address that trauma, to address any of those other areas that might have contributed, drug, alcohol, finance, debt. And being psychologically safe is really important before you can even begin to address offending behaviour. So I spent a lot of time, yes, as I arrived, people told me it was called Hotel La Moye. It's definitely not a hotel. It's a reasonably institutionalised prison, but it is a safe prison and it is a decent prison. And if a member of my family ended up going to prison, I would absolutely be grateful that it's a safe, decent, secure prison where they can start to tackle some of the issues that are linked with their offending.
Yeah, it's interesting you touched upon trauma there, because the founder of Sanctuary Trust, the local homelessness charity, said they've never seen a prison leaver without a history of trauma, and they accept a lot of admissions from former inmates. So what role should mental health and counselling have inside prison to ultimately help those inmates resolve those kind of traumas before they reintegrate back into the community?
I mean, that question is true of any member of a society, isn't it? If somebody has trauma, whether they're in prison or not in prison, we need to look at kind of what the root cause of that was, and look at how we improve public safety or where that trauma's come from, and we should treat that trauma. Prison is often assumed in the same way that schools are often feel that they're responsible for compensating for parenting or being the parent to the child. Prisons are often seen as the catch-all that should resolve all the ills in society that have led to somebody coming to prison. So although prison absolutely has a role to do that, and sometimes we're best placed because certainly with tall fences and a clean prison, you're well placed when somebody's free of alcohol and drugs to start addressing the root cause of what's going on for them. But it shouldn't just be the prison's responsibility to address trauma in a population. And actually we should look not just at what can the prison do to resolve issues once someone comes to prison, but what's going wrong in society, and something that the Scandinavian countries have done very well to prevent somebody getting in that position and a victim experiencing an incident in the first place.
For many inmates, they often say that something as simple as a letter, an email, a kind of phone call, or even a visit can sort of mean the world to them. Charities like Prisoners Abroad, really report the impact of kind of receiving a Christmas card or a letter and books. So how important is kind of just basic human contact and socialization for prisoners, and just having an emotional support network of friends and family around an inmate help to reduce their kind of likelihood of reoffending, in your view?
Really important. Yeah. One of those 7 pathways I describe is about children and families, about connection, about human connection and being humane and humanity, and that's exactly why a degrading kind of tough prison doesn't help prepare somebody for a crime-free life outside. So connection is important for all human beings, and that's why we really focused as a prison. Our branding was about releasing better neighbours, recognising that these are people. They are going to be released and they are going to live next door to one of us. And Jersey gets that. Most people in Jersey know somebody who's been in prison and knows and believes and sees that these people are going to come out and be their neighbours. So I think in lots of ways, as much as there's that Hotel La Moye narrative and, lock them up, I don't think people in Jersey believe that. And I made it my mission to go and speak to any group that would have me to understand that you are these people's neighbours, and the prison in isolation can only do so much. What really matters is those relationships while they're in prison, preparing for release and supporting them to be successful when they do go out of prison. And that's Norway is very clear that when somebody goes into prison, instead of the shame and the sense of rejoicing and I hope they get really long sentence and never come out again, that the societal response is, what on earth happened that somebody in my community ended up going to prison? Mm-hmm. How did we fail? How could we have supported them better? And so the real answer isn't just prison. Mm-hmm. It's a really important part of the criminal justice process. Mm-hmm. And that for some, there does need to be a consequence. Well, for all crimes, there needs to be a just response. Mm-hmm. But for some, there does need to be incapacitation and incarceration. But actually, that should be a phase and a part of the court response, but really it does need to be a societal response about how we look after and come alongside people in our community.
It's interesting that greater degree of empathy in Norway, perhaps, or recognising that it could be a failure of society, or these people have fallen through the cracks of society. I watched a documentary with Michael Moore, the filmmaker, Where to Invade Next, and he spent some time in a Norwegian prison, and he also spoke to some of the sort of bereaved parents of the victims of the Anders Breivik massacre, which is obviously incredibly horrendous. And he interviewed one of the parents who'd experienced a terrible loss and said, what do you want to do to Anders Breivik? Does he deserve to be executed? What kind of form of punishment do you think that it warrants? And they said, no, I believe in the justice system, and I don't think that he should be treated differently to anyone else. And such was their faith.
Incredible.
Mm-hmm. That was really powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Because you'd think somebody in that position, you could have forgiven them for wanting, fire and brimstone, retribution, and all the rest of it. So, yeah.
And the criminal justice system is very important for victims too. And both in the UK and in Jersey, I know a lot of work has gone on to improve putting the victim at the centre. It absolutely, yes, it has to be about rehabilitation, exploring what went on for the offender, but at the centre of justice is an outcome for a victim. And that's an example of where prison gives confidence. And, worse than the actual risk of becoming a victim is the fear of becoming a victim, and we're much more fearful about being victims than the reality. So that confidence in the criminal justice system is so important.
So according to a recent annual report by the State of Jersey Prison Service, 91% of prisoners had accommodation arranged on release, which is a positive statistic, but 46% of those placements were temporary, so shelters, guest houses. Do you think that there's an issue with finding kind of stable housing for released prisoners in Jersey? And do you think that contributes to the 1 in 3 prisoners reoffending after being released? And what can we do about it?
Yeah, really interesting. Housing's difficult in Jersey, and housing offenders can be difficult, and housing offenders of certain crimes can be even more difficult. And so certainly sex offenders are very, very hard to get good support, to get a safe plan in place on release, and particularly difficult in Jersey. Housing is difficult, but actually I was overwhelmed at what's available to people leaving prison in Jersey, how invariably there would be a solution, and never in my time there would the solution be to assume they need to sleep on the streets, and rightly so. That doesn't protect the public, and it's not decent, it's not dignified. But there was always a solution. Very often it was too late. It was very last minute, which meant that all the other things that a prisoner needs to plan to do are difficult to do until you've got an address. But I also understand why in an island where there's a pressure on housing, you can't keep accommodation empty for somebody anticipating their release date. But to think that going to the shelter is a bad outcome is a real shame. And very often when prisoners are offered shelter, they would be really concerned about that, or I'd be contacted by all sorts of people kind of campaigning that they should be given an apartment, or we also shouldn't be using prison or having gone to prison as a reward that puts people above other people on waiting lists, because that's a really perverse outcome. It doesn't feel just to the general public, and it could drive antisocial behaviour and actually inadvertently bring up crime rates. So it needs to be a fair process that people coming out of prison access exactly the same opportunities as anybody else. Going into the shelter actually can be a means of accessing all sorts of ongoing support, and is part of a process that can lead to independent living in Jersey. And I was really impressed, actually, about what was available to people coming out of prison. And also the number of charities, including faith groups in Jersey, who offer to provide or fundraise to support housing options for people. So it's certainly a much more positive picture than what I experienced previously.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, and on that point as well, that the same report revealed that less than half prisoners leaving La Moye had a job lined up on release. And, many inmates want to rebuild their lives and deserve a second chance to do that. And a lot of their crimes may have been motivated by poverty or desperation in the first place. So, what can we do to address that kind of employment gap for released prisoners?
Again, having accommodation early helps, because once you've got an address, you can start doing everything else. We did quite a lot of work on that data, because at the time it was capturing people returning to the UK who just aren't entitled to work in Jersey and don't plan to be here. So not all of the people in prison are from Jersey. Some would choose not to work immediately coming out of prison because potentially they didn't need to work. There are prisoners who are pretty well resourced at La Moye as well. So it's not necessarily a helpful statistic. But again, I was really impressed with the Back to Work scheme in Jersey. And there's a team that specialises in complex cases who would work with people coming out of prison. And even if they didn't have a job immediately, there was all sorts that was being put in place to prepare them for work or to arrange a meeting with them soon after release.
Are there things that government can do, in your view, to incentivise local firms to give released inmates a chance?
I don't think it's a financial thing, actually, because most local firms want to employ people. They've got vacancies. They really want to employ local people so they don't have to provide accommodation. So it's not a lack of vacancies. There is a cultural thing that could happen. And I know of really brave employers who've tried to do the right thing and taken people on who've come out of prison with sex offences, for example. And we know that the best thing you can do to a high-risk offender or somebody with a sex offence or risk of harm is to ensure they've got decent accommodation, a job, a routine, structure, money. And actually, by undermining or outing those employers that are prepared to take that risk has been really detrimental. So I think there is a narrative we could adopt on the island about those employers are brave and doing the right thing for our society, as opposed to outing them as being wrong.
And during your tenure, you focused on a lot of educational resources for prisoners, including providing the opportunity for prisoners to record music. So I think Jersey inmates produced an album called Songs of Freedom with the first ever live performance in the prison's history. So that was a very exciting initiative. My father was actually a former probation officer, and he said that the problem was that if prisoners were forced to choose between kind of study and work, they'd probably choose work because they kind of get paid to do it. Where do you kind of strike the balance there, and what role should education and vocational training have in prison?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I guess it seems perverse to pay people to go into education when it's actually, a real privilege that these opportunities are being provided. However, it is within the prison's gift to decide how they incentivise work and other jobs in the prison. And there was a big pay review to reflect that. Really, my view is that the bit we should incentivise is once somebody's got a really solid plan about what they need to do and how they need to use that time in prison, what we should be incentivising is them working through their plan. So rewarding people who are doing what they need to do over rewarding people for doing what they want to do. And that's an ongoing cultural shift, especially where in some areas, some of the trades or some of the activities had been better paid because of the level of responsibility that they hold, or the importance to the prison of a prisoner doing that role. And so that's well within the control of the prison and the budget setting to decide what you incentivise for prisoners.
So if an inmate comes into prison with a particular skill set or a skilled kind of trade, is that taken into account when they're kind of allocated work within the prison?
Yeah, again, a difficult shift, because if you were acting instinctively or intuitively, you would think that somebody with great carpentry skills should go into the carpentry workshop and make beautiful things so that the prison can sell lovely products.
Yeah.
And actually, outwardly, that's a great story that we'd all reward. It would seem very strange to tell a frustrated carpenter who potentially can't read and write that they need to go and sit in a classroom and learn to read and write. And culturally, that's a big shift to ask prison officers to have those difficult conversations with a prisoner, and everybody consistently saying, we know you're a brilliant carpenter. You're not going into carpentry. You're going to do what you need to do, not what you want to do. And that feels perverse because then you're suppressing gifts. So it's a really hard balance. And like I say, it's not always intuitive. And that requires a really solid sentence plan and a consistent and informed approach by every single professional that prisoner comes into contact with, to ensure it's a consistent narrative about why they can't do carpentry or why they can't do it in mornings and why they've got to do maths and English. So it's a difficult one.
So I found a really good example at HMP Brixton, where they set up Bad Boys Bakery that trained inmates in baking to sell products to commercial clients like Cafe Nero. So that program actually achieved a 3% reoffending rate compared to 40% for the rest of the prison. So do you think La Moye could benefit from similar prison-based social enterprises that give inmates kind of vocational training like that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there are elements of that happening at La Moye, whether that's growing plants for nurseries, some of the carpentry work, some of the recycling for the fisheries. So there are elements of that. And we scoped a project, which I would love to see happen one day, of a coffee cart outside, or actually a cafe, but the interim plan was a coffee cart. Actually, the prison we went to in Bergen, they roast coffee there. And on the coffee bags is a quote from the evidence around reducing reoffending, kind of a scientific quote around behavioural change. And the concept being that coffee bag ends up on every breakfast table in the local community and starts informing the community about rehabilitation and the wider societal responsibility in that. And there's so many skills in that prison. But again, you would need to be very careful not just to exploit existing skills in the workforce or in the prisoner population, and making sure you are developing new people. I would always suggest caution looking at data like a reduction from 40% to 3%, because you are likely to get a self-selecting, very motivated group of people doing some of these projects. And so the data is not always as clear as it might appear to be when we're looking at criminal justice and reoffending rates.
Are there particular categories of offence, like, for example, let's say low-level kind of drug offences, that you feel could or should be rethought in kind of sentencing with things like suspended sentences or kind of community service?
Yeah, I mean, a bit of a cop-out, but it really is a matter for the court,
Yeah.
how they choose to punish and respond to what they've heard in a court hearing. As long as a prison is decent, the problem with prison is even just having that on your record is problematic, even if the experience wasn't traumatic, even if it was a positive. And for many prisoners at La Moye, it is a positive experience. That was a beautiful thing. Releasing people who told us, and I don't take the credit for this, this has been happening for a long time at La Moye and still does, people being released and saying that was a really positive experience. And that's exceptional in Jersey. I met more of those in Jersey than I did elsewhere because of the level of resource investment in the prison.
I think it's actually possible to leave La Moye Prison a Google review. Yes, which I thought was quite amusing. Yeah,
as long as it doesn't say Hotel La Moye, we like feedback.
Sure,
I'm sure.
I suppose, to my point, given that it costs the taxpayer, in the region of something like £70,000 per year per inmate to keep somebody in custody, should we be more discerning about who we choose to lock up, particularly for like non-violent offences, let's say? You've already said that it's really a matter for the courts, but I suppose it's just more of a philosophical question.
Yeah, the important thing when getting a custodial sentence is knowing why. And there could be much better connection between the court and the sentencing and the sentence planning, not specific to Jersey, but more broadly, in terms of understanding that people go to prison for different reasons, and yet we treat them in quite homogeneously. So if somebody's there for punishment, potentially that should be a different experience too. If somebody was there because they have shown that they're hopelessly alcoholic and just cannot manage that in the community. So it might be there for a rehabilitative opportunity to dry out in a really controlled environment. So I think there could be greater connection kind of at that philosophical level about why is somebody there. There's various principles of imprisonment and why people go to prison, and yet their experience is the same when they get there. So there could be a wider piece around that.
And if you had a blank slate and a magic wand, how would you redesign La Moye today? Like, what's something, a single thing that you might do to change things that will make a big impact?
I would work with what's there, as I was. The foundations are good. The prison employs really good, decent people with great relationships that have known most of the prisoners for a very long time, went to school with them and really cares about them as kind of Jersey residents. I would continue the work about joining up what happens on the island. And if I could do one thing, it would be an IT system that has the 7 pathways, the things that we need to address, and speaks to all the other departments that we need involvement from. So that rather than working in a siloed way, and we were getting much better at connecting with other departments, but it was still quite manual, we would be able to work with the Department of Education. We got much better at doing that with health. We came a really long way with that for health. We did it very well with Social Security, but in quite a manual way and picking up the telephone. So it would be a system. And I think as cloud technology evolves, we must be getting quite close to a place we can do that. You obviously need to be careful which information is shared in 2 directions and not being able to access everyone else's systems, which is the complexity and why people use different systems. But it would be it would be a product that would start really joining that stuff up.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, just final question. We've spoken about data and kind of statistics and how reliable that they might be. But Jersey's 5-year reoffending rate is around 38%, which is slightly higher than the UK average. We have a prison population of about 176 inmates in a facility that's designed for 200. So if Jersey did become the most progressive prison in Britain, what metrics should we use to kind of judge success? Is it reoffending rate? Is it employment rates post-release? Is it mental health outcomes, or is it something else, or is it all of those things?
That's really interesting. And I spent a long time talking to my Norwegian mentor about this. And on such a small island where we're really talking about a very small number of people, 170, you can fit on two sides of A4. We should be talking about one life at a time and understanding the story for that person and making sure that both their experience in prison and in community on release means that they never commit another offence and they never come back.
Susie Richardson, thank you very much.
My pleasure, thank you.